All right, guys, in part two of the chapter nine lecture on water and minerals, I wanted to kind of look at some specific examples of minerals. And if you remember from the earlier part of chapter nine, they categorize minerals really based on quantity. And so there's a couple of main categories here. And so today, in this video, I wanted to kind of go over some of the major minerals. These are needed in a little bit higher amounts. Again, we're talking about micro nutrients as far as minerals go, because again, you don't need a lot of these. Even the major minerals, you're going to see that you don't need vast amounts compared to something like carbohydrates or lipids, fats, and proteins. But still, um, the cutoff here for major minerals is about 100 milligrams or more per day. Some of these you see more quantities. So, for example, sodium, it's about 2,000 milligrams of sodium. And so you do see higher amounts for different minerals, but in general, a major mineral. And the table here kind of shows you the ones we're going to be looking at, mainly calcium. We'll talk a little bit about sodium, potassium. We'll talk a little bit about chloride, magnesium, mention a few things about sulfur. So we'll look at most of these as examples of major minerals in the body. In the last video, I want to go over that I'll go over is trace minerals, and those are needed in even smaller amounts, so less than 100 milligrams per day. So some of these you're probably already familiar with, of course, something like calcium. It is the most plentiful mineral in the body. Of course, you're going to find that in your bones. That's 98, 99, 99% of the calcium that we store in our bodies is stored in the bones, in the bone matrix. It is hormone regulated, so the balance of your calcium, how much is being stored versus how much goes into the bloodstream, how much is being retained in the body, all of that's hormone controlled. You have two main hormones, and you can go into this, look at this. If you take an anatomy class, you've got two main hormones that's trying to balance the amount of calcium in the blood. And of course, don't forget about vitamin D. That works as a hormone. We talked about vitamin D in the last chapter. Vitamin D basically tries to retain calcium from your kidneys, from your intestines, so that you're holding on to that calcium that you have. Don't forget also that these minerals are something that you have to ingest. Your body is not making calcium on its own. It's required. You got to have it. We'll see some of the functions here, but it's not something that you can manufacture. So you have to have it in your diet. And of course, you can get it from these minerals from plants and proteins and animals and things, or you can have supplements. And so we'll look at some of those as we go through. So why do you need calcium? Of course, the main answer, of course, is bone development, bone maintenance. Your bones are always going through a little bit of a repair type process. And so that calcium is obviously needed for strong bones. That's very important. But we also have to realize that you also need calcium for things like muscle contraction. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about, the three main types of muscles, the skeletal muscles that our skeleton to move, our biceps and our triceps and all of that, or if you're talking about your heart, the muscle, your cardiac muscle that makes up the heart, or your smooth muscles, those all require calcium. Calcium is needed as a blood clotting factor. And so most of the clotting factors in the blood you may think of as proteins that are there. You need vitamin K as a blood clotting factor, but you also need calcium there as well. Your nervous system requires calcium. Even though it's a small amount, your nervous system requires calcium ions to help transmit those electrical signals, those action potentials, through the nervous system. And then general cell metabolic type reactions are going to require calcium as well. Where do we find calcium? And again, this is probably between this and sodium, probably the two most widely known about minerals, if you want to think of it this way. So you probably have a good idea of where you're going to find calcium in your diet, but of course it's in dairy products, milk, yogurt, cheese. That's where we get most of our calcium from. You can find some calcium in fruits and vegetables, of course. You can find some calcium, especially in those green leafy type vegetables, kale and broccoli and things um, that have and cabbage and things. Those green leafy type vegetables will have higher amounts of calcium in it also. And of course, you can get calcium supplements. Again, go down the supplement aisle sometime, or take a look around where you do your shopping at, and you'll see um, uh, calcium as a supplement by itself. Sometimes you see calcium and vitamin D go together. And again, remember, you need the vitamin D to help balance your calcium, or at least to help retain calcium. And so you see a lot of products that have supplements, and a lot of food sources, and we'll see this also, are fortified with calcium. So you may have orange juice that may not normally have calcium there, or have very little calcium there, is fortified with calcium. So they've added calcium to that food product there. Other places, some medicines have calcium in there. Calcium and some of its calcium compounds can be used as an antacid. How much do you need? Well, you don't have to memorize all these numbers and things for a test or anything, but I think it's important to kind of realize that there are recommended dietary allowances. There's some of these numbers that we looked at, the RDA, again, that's the average amount that is needed to basically provide the required amount for just about everybody in the population. So about 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium basically gives you enough calcium in your diet to satisfy just about everybody. It's like 98% of the population. This will work fine for. And there's some other conditions that kind of play into effect. Whether you're going through a growth spurt, you may need more as an adolescent. You may need a little bit more calcium in your diet. Older individuals don't absorb calcium as well. So a lot of times you see older individuals having calcium supplements and things like that. Generally, women tend to have more problems storing calcium. And so we'll talk about osteoporosis, and that tends to be higher in women than in men. And so one of the things to kind of think about, not just for this mineral, but for others, is that how much we have in our diet doesn't necessarily equal how much we're actually using in our bodies. And so, as the statement says here, healthy adults absorb about 30% of the calcium that's in our food. So, we can be eating calcium-rich foods like milk and dairy products and cheese and vegetables and things, but you can only use a portion of that. And that number kind of fluctuates. Sometimes it's a little bit higher, sometimes it's a little bit lower. It depends on the age group. It depends on what kind of calcium it is. Not all calcium that's in foods is the same, because calcium forms compounds. So sometimes it's calcium carbonate, sometimes it's calcium citrate. It's other forms of calcium. So whichever form you're getting, in other words, a lot of times it's not just plain elemental calcium that's in the food that you're eating. And so depending on what form it's in, what compound it's in, will determine how well your body absorbs it. Sometimes foods have other ingredients in the food, or other compounds in the food, that actually causes it to block calcium absorption. I read an article about I think it's like spinach and some of those good healthy green leafy vegetables that do have calcium there, but they also have other compounds there that tend to block the absorption. And so, depending on how much, and there also seems to be a correlation between, if you have higher amounts of calcium, you actually decrease how much you're absorbing. So it doesn't always, which sounds, contradictory, but it doesn't always mean, if I take in more, I'm actually going to use more. That's not always true. And so, as we get older, especially women, we want to take some calcium supplements, make sure you have good bone density, but sometimes taking more can actually cause your body to absorb less. So it's a little tricky there. during different stages of life, infancy, early adolescence, you may be absorbing more. Pregnancy, you're absorbing more. As you get older, you're not absorbing it quite as easily. Okay. Can you have too much? Sure, you can have too much, although this is pretty rare. I've read of cases before where individuals, for whatever reason, were taking additional calcium to too high of amount, really. Maybe they already had some calcium in their diet they weren't aware of, but they were taking really a mega dose of calcium each day, and it actually can have toxic effects to the body. And again, you don't have to memorize the numbers there, but the UL, the upper limit, that toxicity level is somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500. Sometimes I've seen it reported as around 3,000 milligrams a day. Above that, that's too much, right? So again, your recommended is about 1,000 or so. And so too much, maybe you don't realize, hey, if I'm taking antacids, those actually have calcium there. If I'm taking a multivitamin or another calcium supplement that I don't realize is, adding to my calcium number, I'm already having foods that have calcium there. Maybe I've got vitamin D that I'm taking. Remember, vitamin D is holding on to calcium. So all these things contribute to how much calcium that you have on a daily basis. And so having too much, that's called hypercalcemia. The emia there means it's in the blood, too high of calcium levels in the blood. And that can actually cause some problems here, bone pain, muscle weakness, fatigue, and it could build up and precipitate out and cause kidney stones. Most of you are probably familiar with the term osteoporosis. That prefix osteo refers to bone, and porosis means that it's porous or has extra spacing there. And the image there kind of shows you what a healthy bone looks like on the left. In other words, that bone matrix is this is spongy bone. That bone matrix is very strong. I know it looks like there's a lot of spaces in there, but that's how the bone is. That creates like a lattice structure or a scaffolding structure that helps support the bone. But if you don't have the correct amount of calcium, if you're not absorbing it like you should, then that scaffolding is weakened, and you don't have as much of this bone matrix formed there. And so you can imagine the image here on the right side, that would be that would weaken the bone, causing breaks or bone fractures more easily. So what can we do to try to reduce the risk of osteoporosis? Of course, taking a look at our diet, making sure we have calcium or calcium enriched or fortified foods in our diet, making sure our vitamin D is where it needs to be. We're getting some maybe sunlight. We're getting some from vitamin D fortified food sources. We've got calcium, dairy products that are in our diet, or we've got, other sources of calcium, including those green leafy vegetables I mentioned earlier. But exercise also helps. Exercise helps to strengthen our bones. And so exercise, weight-bearing exercise, using those weights and muscles to really strengthen our bones, because that basically helps those bone cells help build up that matrix a little bit stronger, a little bit faster. And so exercise actually helps in our bone density. All right, another major mineral that we're familiar with is sodium. We're talking about sodium chloride for salt, but you can get sodium in other places. This is the main place we get sodium in our diet is salt, sodium chloride, but you can get sodium in baking powder, that's sodium bicarbonate. You can get sodium in MSG, monosodium glutamate. So there's other food sources out there that have sodium there. So this is not the only one, and I don't know the percentage really, but you get the majority of your sodium through salt, table salt, sodium chloride. Again, you don't have to know the numbers, but the RDA, that dietary allowance, the recommended dietary allowance for salt or sodium, is about 2,300 milligrams. So about a teaspoon, if you can imagine what a teaspoon looks like, about a teaspoon of salt is what our diet requires. I've read different estimates, but some estimates suggest we get maybe about 3,000, 3,500 milligrams in our American diet, which is obviously more than what is recommended. And so one of the problems I think is, we know how much salt we put on our foods out of a salt shaker, but what we don't always realize is what salt is already in the foods. Maybe it's used in processing the foods. Maybe it's in whether it's a processed meat type product, or it's used as a preservative. And so sometimes we, buy a can of vegetables, we think we're doing pretty good because we got, a vegetable, but if it's canned, then it probably has a high amount of salt there as a preservative. So it's always better, if we can, to buy fresh vegetables. That way we can control the amount of salt a little bit better. And we know exactly how much we're adding to it. I know sodium gets a lot of bad information, and we'll talk about, some of its kind of bad effects on the body a little bit, but you do need it. And that's why you need about a teaspoon a day. Because it is needed. It is a positively charged ion, so it's a cation. You do need it to help with conducting nerve impulses. So it's used in those action potentials, or those electrical signals that's going out through the brain and spinal cord out to our muscles. It is needed in balancing the ion balance in a cell. It's needed for helping glucose and amino acids. Nutrients actually get into cells, and that's because you have things called sodium-potassium pumps that use energy and that require sodium and potassium to function. And so you need that to help actively transport things like glucose and amino acids into cells. And of course, normal muscle function, it doesn't matter if you're talking about smooth muscle that you find in your blood vessels or your organs. Some of your organs have it. It could be cardiac muscle that you find in your heart. It could be skeletal muscle that you find connected to our bones. And we do want to mention a couple things about hypertension or high blood pressure, because sodium is one of those ions that causes our body to retain extra fluids. There's other things out there, but this is one of those that causes our body to hold on to extra fluid. That extra fluid goes into our cardiovascular system, goes into our circulatory system, where our heart then has to pump harder to get it to go through the body, through the circulatory system. And so when the heart's having to work a little harder, that increases our blood pressure. You may be familiar with these terms, systolic and diastolic, that you see there. And so this number down here, this is, an example of a blood pressure reading, 118/75. That top number is that systolic number. It's always higher here because this is where you're talking about measuring the pressure in the blood vessels in an artery whenever the heart is actually contracting. When it's pumping, you've got the greater amount of force there. So the pressure that's building up, if you think about the heart and you got the different chambers, when that heart beats, especially when you're talking about that left ventricle pumping, contracting, creating enough pressure to push blood up and out of that ventricle through the vessels there, the aorta, out through the body. When it's pumping, it's generating pressure. That's the systolic pressure. When it's relaxing, when it's not contracting, it's going to relax. There's still pressure there, but it's not as great as when it's contracting. So as it relaxes, the pressure is referred to as diastolic. And so these are these two numbers here. And you generally see that quote unquote normal number is 120/80. That's kind of like your high end of normal. It's kind of better if you have it a little bit lower than that 120/80. But again, it's the sodium that leads to, or can lead to, hypertension or high blood pressure. And so there's kind of your definition there. Chronic condition characterized by having elevated blood pressure. Problems here associated with hypertension, and you're probably familiar with these, some kind of heart disease. It's causing the heart to work harder to push the blood through the body. It could lead to a blockage somewhere, whether it's in the heart, and we have a heart attack. If it's in the brain, it's called a stroke. It could lead to problems in the kidneys, because the kidneys have really small blood vessels in the kidneys, and if they become too much pressure in those blood vessels, the kidneys can't function like they need to, or it could cause other organ damage. But a lot of times you do see it chronically, long-term hypertension affecting something like the kidneys. And so, it's always good to check blood pressure. If you haven't done this in a while, check your own blood pressure, or you can go and have it screened somewhere. You can go have it tested somewhere, get an idea of what your blood pressure is. And if you do have high or pre-hypertension or hypertension, look for ways that you can decrease your sodium. That's one of the first things you need to try to do. Look at your diet, see ways that you can decrease the sodium, and you're going to see a big effect usually, because that helps you to decrease water retention, and that'll help decrease your blood pressure. So think about those things. Another one that we'll look at briefly now is potassium, and you do see this related to sodium. These kind of go together a little bit. It is also a positively charged ion, just like sodium, just like calcium is. So that would be cations. You generally find this inside of cells. So that's why it's called it's inside of the intracellular fluid. So it's generally found inside of a cell. And it's helping to kind of balance the ion concentration inside of cells, especially things like muscle cells and nerve cells. And so there again, it's needed for having the correct nervous system functions, having the correct muscle contractions, having the correct kidney function is very important here. It's balanced in the body through the kidneys. It's also hormonally controlled. So your kidneys are trying to get rid of extra potassium if it starts building up. And your hormones are trying to balance how much you actually have in the body, whether you're retaining it or getting rid of it. And there's been studies that suggest that having potassium in our diets, foods that naturally have potassium there, some healthy, fruits and vegetables and things that naturally have potassium, bananas, of course, orange juice has potassium rich. They help to reduce our overall blood pressure as well. You can also get, we're talking about sodium, you can get salt substitutes. You can kind of look at that because, this is the example of salt that most of us are familiar with, sodium chloride. But if you do have a problem with sodium, you can get sodium-free or low sodium type salts out there. And so potassium is one of those, potassium chloride is one of those salts that can be used as a salt substitute. And so that doesn't affect your sodium levels since it has a salt based on potassium. All right, another of the major minerals, we'll mention a few things about magnesium. Magnesium you see a lot in different types of biochemical reactions. It's actually part of reactions that it works as basically like a cofactor, or like we mentioned, a coenzyme, some type of molecule that helps these different types of chemical reactions take place. Some of these are energy related reactions. Some of these are reactions needed to get our muscles working correctly and our nervous system function working correctly. But usually you find magnesium involved in some kind of chemical reaction taking place in the body. It's needed to help in our immune system. One of the best places to find magnesium is plants. And that's because magnesium is naturally found in a pigment you probably have heard of, familiar with, called chlorophyll, that green pigment that plants have. Magnesium is an ion that's right in the middle of that chlorophyll structure. And so when we eat plants, vegetables, especially those green leafy vegetables, you eat these plants, and so your body can digest and digest that chlorophyll and actually use that magnesium as part of that plant source. Let's talk about another one, chloride. You don't hear as much about this one as some of the others. One thing I'd like to point out is that this is a negatively charged ion. This is there's a few negatively charged ions that you find. This is one of the main ones. So this is what's called an anion, negatively charged ion. It's found in extracellular fluid, and so you find this in our blood vessels or in our blood, in the plasma, floating around or being transported in the body. And it's there to mainly help with fluid balance. It's acid-base balance. It's important there. It actually goes to help form the acid that's in our digestive tract. So that's in our stomach. The hydrochloric acid that we use to digest foods in our stomach is hydrochloric acid. So that requires chlorine. And it's also involved in transport of what's called a chloride shift inside of the bloodstream. It's basically balancing the amount of ions in our bloodstream. One more we'll look at is sulfur. And again, here this is a major mineral, but you need it in pretty small amounts. I didn't write down the RDA for these couple of here, and so you don't hear about this one as much, but it is required. It is needed in some amino acids, and they're listed there for you: methionine and cysteine. These amino acids are needed to make proteins, and so some proteins will have small amounts of sulfur that's part of that protein molecule. Some vitamins, biotin and thiamine, these are some of those B vitamins we talked about back in chapter 8. They require sulfur as part of their structure as well. And so these kind of go into metabolism or metabolic type reactions. Best place to find sulfur is in foods that have a lot of protein in it. So again, proteins, when we eat proteins, we digest those down to amino acids, and then we digest and kind of break apart some of those parts of the amino acids, including the sulfur that's naturally found in methionine, cysteine. And so things that have protein in it, of course, meat products, dairy products, and then plant-based products such as legumes, beans, of course, have high amounts of protein there. And so that's where we're going to find the best sources for sulfur. And so sulfur is needed to make other proteins. And so remember, enzymes are proteins. And so sulfur is needed to make sure that these enzymes are working correctly, but also for antioxidant molecules. Remember, we talked about those a little bit in the last chapter. Antioxidants help to supply those extra electrons to those free radical type ions that can affect things like our DNA repair mechanisms, or our DNA, our proteins in the body, but also lipids in our cell membranes. That's all of the major minerals that I want to mention. In the next lecture, the last lecture for this chapter 9, I wanted to go through a little bit about those the next category of those minerals that we'll see as the trace minerals, and we'll do the same type of thing here by going through these trace minerals. All right, thanks, guys.